Is it true that guns are dangerous, but not having one is even more dangerous? Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Sue Jeffers for Libertarian Viewpoint. Libertarianism is all about liberty, the exercise of freedom that doesn't impinge on the rights of others. We constantly hear the drum roll of government solutions. This show's purpose is to allow you to see for yourself why non-government solutions are a better alternative. Today our guest is John Caile. Everything you wanted to know about guns. Hello, John. Welcome.
Hi, Sue. Good to see you again.
Why don't you tell our viewers just a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, I come from a very political family. My grandfather was a famous criminal court judge in the city of Chicago. My great-grandfather was a political power broker. He was a Democrat, but as somebody once said, the Democrats of his day would be conservative Republicans or Libertarians today. I came to Minnesota in February of 1995. The second day I was here, I was almost the victim of an attempted mugging. I bluffed my way out of it. Essentially, I had the guy convinced that I actually was carrying a gun, and he took off. Now, about 5 minutes afterwards, I was shaking like a leaf, so I went to talked to a couple of people, and they said, well, you know, in this state, we actually do have a carry permit law. It's pretty hard to get one, but I said, okay. So I went down to my, at the time I lived in Minnetonka when I moved here, and went to the police chief and applied, and when he handed me the application, the desk sergeant said, well, you can fill this out, but I wouldn't bother if I were you, and that kind of caught my eye. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, the chief doesn't like to give them out. I said, what do you mean he doesn't like to give them out? I mean, I've never been in trouble with the law. I'm a good citizen. I've come here to work for Carlson Companies, this big company here in Minnesota. And he said, well, yeah, but the chief has to decide if you need one or not. I said, now, wait a minute. How does he decide if I need one? And they went through all the rigmarole that you're probably all familiar with. So I filled everything out, sent it in, and promptly in about 10 days got a letter of rejection. I wrote a 3-page letter to then Governor Arnie Carlson. And it was a very nice, printed out letter, hand-signed in an envelope with a stamp. And I described my travails. Now, I've gotten letters back from 3 American presidents, numerous governors and legislators, both, state and congressional. I didn't even get one of those little cards that says, thank you for contacting the governor. And then years later, I met him on the set of one of the TV stations here. And, he offered to shake my hand, and I did kind of limply. I said, Governor, I said, you blew it for me when I first moved here. He said, what do you mean? And I explained the story to him, and he tried to hem and haw and talk about how his staff didn't do this. I said, Governor, a hand-signed letter in an envelope with a stamp is, you probably know, the highest form of communication in politics. It's the one that lands on the president's desk. I said, for whatever reason, I never even got an acknowledgement. And I said, and you know what they say, the buck stops here. And then it was a very awkward silence after that.
And then you spent...
And that's when I got involved with the movement. I've been shooting since I was 8 years old. I've been teaching firearm safety and combat training for about 35 years now. And I got involved with what was then called Conceal Carry Reform, now the organization working to change the laws. Now, we now call ourselves the Gun Owner Civil Rights Alliance, because now that the carry law is passed, our focus is more general in terms of protecting our rights to own and carry firearms. So that's pretty much how I got to Minnesota and how I got involved locally in the political scene. And I've met a lot of great people. As you well know from working with the legislature, there's some good people over there, and there's some that are not so good. Okay. So it's been an education.
Yeah. Oh, it's always an education over there. I keep telling everyone, when the legislature's in session, nobody's safe, as I paraphrase Mark Twain.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about, there are so many misconceptions out there about gun ownership, about what you can do, what you can't do, who can carry, who can't carry. And I want to talk about, before we get to there, I want to talk about the initial battle of getting the carry law passed in the state of Minnesota twice, which was what, almost 10 years ago now?
Right.
8 years ago. And it was funny because I was over at the Capitol that day. And I walk in, and there are all these Democrats running around in bulletproof vests.
I remember that.
And I'm like, what did I miss? What is going on here? And all of a sudden it dawned on me, oh, the carry bill is going to be heard today. So why don't you talk just a little bit about the carry bill getting passed?
Well, we finally got it passed in spring of 2003 after 9 years working on it. And this work was started originally by Professor Joe Olson, David Gross, people like that, even before I got here. I just got involved in, as I say, 1995. We finally got it passed. And then, of course, there was a challenge by the churches. Now, the interesting thing about that challenge is we didn't sue the churches because they didn't want to put up a sign. They sued us because they thought we demanded that they put it. There was a specific wording in the law about for private businesses and establishments that don't want people to carry guns. You know, we are big libertarian property rights people. That's fine if you want to do that. And to make a long story short, for the only sixth time in its history, the Minnesota Supreme Court used the single subject rule. You know, it was sort of like you're on a motorcycle going 63 miles an hour in a 55 zone, and everybody else is going 63 or more, and they decide to pull you over, but nobody else. You know, so we knew that it was a politically motivated decision. So we went back and actually passed it by a greater margin in both the House and the Senate, again in 2005. Now, naturally, every time any state wants to pass what's called a shall issue permit law, the same arguments come out of the woodwork. Everyone will be shooting each other at stop signs over parking spaces. Every altercation in a restaurant will turn into a shootout, the Wild West.
Every Viking game.
Every Viking, the same thing. And of course, none of that happened. Were there a few errant permit holders who did some things they shouldn't have done? Yes. But the percentage is so tiny as to be almost statistically insignificant. Permit holders are, by and large, the most law-abiding citizens in every area of their lives. Permit holders don't even get DWIs at anywhere near the rate that the average sampling of the citizenry would get. So we pretty much once again proved we were right, they were wrong. We now have over 92,500 permit holders in the state, and they are, for the most part, dramatically better behaved than all of their other citizens put together. So
92,000 permit holders.
And it really hasn't slacked off. It's continuing to grow kind of steadily every month. Yeah. And I've taught over 3,000 people myself. I have very good relations with Rich Stanek, the Hennepin County Sheriff, Matt Bostrom, the new Ramsey County Sheriff, and Studnicka, the Sheriff down in Scott County. I keep close tabs on what's going on. I listen to their concerns, if they have any, and we kind of disseminate that through the gun rights group so that we're always kind of up on top of what law enforcement really thinks, not what the press reports they think.
Exactly, and there's a big difference.
Yes.
Very
Line
big
police
difference.
officers, I've got cops' phone numbers in my cell phone. I was just at lunch with a couple of cops. They are so supportive of people carrying guns because they know who the real problem is. They're not worried about pulling over Oldie and Lena, and Lena's got a 38 in her waistband or something. They know who the problems are. But what the press does is report the comments made by chiefs of police who are politically motivated because they work for either the city council, the mayor, or both. So a lot of misconceptions in the public about that.
I want to get to, in a little bit, some of the legislation that's being considered over at the Capitol currently. But before we do that, you teach gun safety, you teach gun training, you teach people how to go about getting their carry permit. So let's talk about some of the misconceptions that are out there.
Yeah, we call them these little urban myths. Usually you'll hear some guy in a gun store make some categorical pronouncement about the law, like, well, Fred, if you're holding the gun at a 45-degree angle, that's not assault. Oh, really? I didn't know. You got to decide, right? Of course, you can be charged. There's 5 levels of assault. You can be charged with assault for a variety of things, never even touching your gun. So it's much more complicated. But the biggest problem is people think that the law is something precise. The law is imprecise. I work with some of the top criminal defense attorneys across the country. I stay in touch by email and phone. When there's a new case, they call me, I call them, I ask their advice. In my class, I refer to them as these guys. And by that I mean guys with French cuffs and cufflinks that cost more than your house. That's not a joke. This is a guy I met down in Milwaukee at the NRA convention. He's a defense attorney in Denver. He drives a Bentley. I said, now let me ask you something. You're going to listen to some goofball in a gun store? And it's always, well, you know, my brother's uncle's nephew's grandmother, who was once a police officer when she was, 12 years ago, says this, right? Well, no. These guys know what they're talking about. They will tell you self-defense is not precise. It's always open to interpretation. It's constantly being reinterpreted in courts, and it's not a simple case to win. It's one of the most difficult to win.
Are you seeing a lot more women take?
Oh, absolutely. If there's a single trend that I have seen, when my first few classes, and I was doing classes like crazy in the first 6 months that the law was passed, naturally we were swamped. You'd occasionally, in a class, I keep my classes small, between 12 and 15 people, you'd see maybe one woman if you were lucky. And then gradually it was 2 or 3, right? And then just this past year, I had 2 public classes in a row, which purely by chance were all women. Just ended up that way. Many of them new, never owned a gun before in their life. So that's been a remarkable change. I read somewhere recently that a survey indicated that 25 years ago, women were asked, do you own a firearm? And the answer is about 25% would say yes, right? It's 47% today. That's a huge increase. But even that is misunderstood. If you grew up you were born in the last 40 years, you'd think that women hate guns because they've been taught by TV and everything else that guns are bad. You know, you're supposed to, you see a gun sitting on a desk, you recoil as if you're looking at a rattlesnake and its rattles going. But that was a recent phenomenon starting in the 60s. Prior to that, women were very much involved in shooting sports in the 30s, 40s, 50s. Most people don't know, in the 1950s, more women regularly went to a gun range to do trap shooting, pheasant hunting, target shooting, than golfed. Now, who would believe that today? But the nice thing is the tide is turning. If you notice, and TV is oddly responsible for that unintentionally. We all know Hollywood hates guns as a rule. They love having guns in their movies to make money off of us, but they generally will donate millions of dollars to gun control, as long as they don't have to give up theirs, of course, and their armed bodyguards. Hello, Rosie. But what's happening on television is more and more strong females are being shown. The female detective is no longer the assistant. She's the lead detective, and she's the one that carries the gun. And I was talking to Bob about this earlier, that you'll see women not only just, they're carrying guns, but they'll see them at the gun range shooting. And I think that's had a lot to do with younger women especially see that, and here's this attractive, strong woman role model, right? And she likes guns, right? So I think you're gradually seeing a shift toward gun ownership once again being something that women are not ashamed of. In fact, they're kind of proud of it.
I don't want to brag or anything, but when I went on a cruise, we had a trap shooting contest. Guess who won for the whole boat? Beat the men too. Oh yeah, me. Yeah. I was quite proud of myself.
Yeah. Why am I not surprised?
I know. But I love to shoot. Yeah. I love guns. But there still is a segment of the population, a lot of Democrats, a lot of liberals, of course, right. Hollywood media, and some women who don't understand what they learn at a gun safety class or at a carry permit class. Yeah. Well, briefly, not every detail.
I couldn't. Take me 3.5 hours just for that part.
If they decided they wanted to get their carry permit and they attended one of your classes, what's a few things they'd learn?
Well, they'd learn, first of all, that self-defense is a last resort. Lethal force is an absolute last resort. You do everything possible to avoid confrontations, to avoid even getting into situations that could lead to a confrontation. As one of my students said, I ran into a gun show the other day, and I hadn't seen him in like 4 years, and he says, "Oh, how you doing?" I said, "Well, what do you remember from my class?" He said, "I remember my horn button better have dust on it." Right? And I spend like 20 minutes just talking about why road rage is one of the stupidest and most dangerous things you can do, not just physically, but legally. So you learn to avoid confrontations in the first place, because one of the first rules of self-defense is that you can't claim self-defense unless you can persuade the jury that you were at all times throughout this entire incident a reluctant participant, absent any aggression or provocation on your part at all. You can even start out being viewed that way, but by reacting incorrectly. In other words, you're driving down the highway, somebody throws, some drunk teenagers come by and throw a half-full beer can, cracks your windshield. You start chasing them, to, you know, I'm going to get their license number and everything, at that moment, it is potentially possible that you'd be viewed now as the aggressor, because instead of looking to get away, call 911, why, Ms. Jeffers, did you then pursue who you already claim were potentially dangerous young men, right? Well, you don't have too much of an explanation for that. You have to be in immediate fear of death or great bodily harm. Now, here's the deal. It isn't, oh, well, I was in fear for my life. No, you have to persuade the jury that any reasonable person standing in their shoes would have sincerely and honestly believed that they were about to be killed or injured. And then the jury gets to decide if there were reasonable grounds at the time of the incident to justify that belief. It's a two-parter. You can't have any less lethal option available to you. Larger people have a tough time. If a 6'4", 250-pound guy is approached by two young punks about 5'9", scrawny, 140 pounds, the jury's going to say, well, you could have probably handled both of those with your own physical size and strength. You didn't have to point a gun at them. So that's what we call the lesser force rule. And the final rule, which is we're going to have to address, is that under Minnesota laws with most states, you have an obligation, if you can get out of the situation, you're obligated to retreat from the situation before using deadly force. And that's could be a segue into the pending legislation that we were talking about off air.
Well, we have two pieces of legislation in particular that I want to talk about today. One is called Stand Your Ground. One is called the Caile Doctrine.
Correct.
Which one would you like to start with?
Let's start with Caile Doctrine, because often people conflate the two. Caile Doctrine just goes back to the old English common law. You may not be a king, a prince, or a duke, but every man's home is his castle. That's where it comes from. And it says that basically you shouldn't have to try to retreat from inside your own domicile, because where are you going to go? It's unreasonable to expect you to try to get out of your own house if you're in a dangerous situation. Now, this new bill is simply going to expand the definition of domicile, your environs. In fact, the legal term is called curtilage, meaning your property. Well, where does that start? Unfortunately, some people will mistake that for a hunting license. In other words, it says you have the right to defend yourself in your yard, your garage, or your house. Well, that's true if you're already in your garage or in your yard doing something. You're working in the garden, and three guys meander in and say, hey, what you got in the garage, pal? What it does not mean is that now you look out from your back door, you're getting a little drink of water at the kitchen sink, and you hear a noise in your detached garage. And you see a flashlight going around out there, and you've got your motorcycle and all your good stuff out there. It does not mean you're going to be just fine if you grab a shotgun and go out the door. Because as soon as you go out that door, in spite of the fact that you are still within your property as defined by the new Caile Doctrine, a good prosecutor will easily persuade a jury, wouldn't any reasonable person stay inside where they're safe? So it's all open to interpretation. Too many people say, but the law says. My grandfather, the judge, had a great comeback for that. What does the law say? I'll tell you what it says. Depends who's reading it today. And he's right, isn't he? Mm-hmm. How many times have we seen, what was it? We had a 9-0 Supreme Court decision the other day. First one in like 48 years, right? It's usually 6-3, 5-4.
Far too often, 5-4.
Oh, yes, and we know exactly who those 5 and 4 are. And that my grandfather was right. On that day, 5 people said, this is what the law says. And 4 people said, no, it doesn't, it said that. It's always open to interpretation. There's no such thing as a sure thing in the law. So we try to teach people that when it comes to self-defense, give yourself every benefit of the doubt. And to me, I will continue to teach my course the same way. To avoid that confrontation, if at all possible, call 911 and hang up. That's another thing we can talk about later. But the second part of that is the one of most interest to carry permit holders. That's the expanding the Caile Doctrine law. They call it the Stand Your Ground bill. I don't know that that's the best phrasing I would have used, but it makes the point that if you're anywhere you have a legal right to be, you're walking down a street, walking your dog in a park, with your kids at some outdoor function, you're sitting in a restaurant, anywhere in the public sphere, and you have a legal right to be there, you shouldn't be required to retreat before using deadly force. Well, it sounds simple, but like everything else, the devil's in the details. Does it give us a little bit more protection if we pass that? Yes, it does raise the bar for prosecutors, because it's a tool they no longer have directly in their toolbox. well, Sue, you were a reluctant participant, you didn't provoke this confrontation, we agree you were reasonably immediate fear in this, and you had no lesser force available, you had no other choice but to use your firearm, but you should have run away, right? So that's gone. But it doesn't mean that it's out. It just means that it's going to have to be handled a little differently. So both the pro-gun people and the anti-gun people are not correct when they say, oh, this will change everything. I've talked to prosecutors recently about this, and they say, oh yeah, they're already working on their tactics to how to get around that. Again, is it a good thing? Yes. Do I support it? Absolutely. But as with all things legal, caution is always the best watchword. And if I can get out of a situation without having to take another person's life, if for no other reason than pure self-serving, right, my life will be a lot less painful and a lot less expensive if I don't have to shoot somebody. So even for purely selfish reasons, if I can get out of a situation without having to shoot somebody, I'm going to do it.
So what are the odds of these bills passing?
Well, it's odd because we're in an election year, a very important election year. There's a reluctance, even among a lot of Republicans, as you have seen, the linguini spine versions especially.
We have plenty of them.
Ideally, I'd like to see it pass through both houses and then land on Dayton's desk and now put up or shut up, right? He either has to sign it and tick off his anti-gun contingency, or not sign it and let a lot of voters in this state who might be Union Democrats typically, but boy, when their gun rights are in any way threatened, they'll jump across the line as they did with Al Gore. I mean, it's pretty well known that gun owners made the difference, costing Gore the election. And Democrats know that. He'd prefer that it never get to his desk, just as the national carry recognition bill that's in the Congress. Obama will never let that get passed out of the Senate because for the same reason. He does not want to have it on his desk. He'd rather vote present, right?
Exactly.
And that's, so I wish I were more confident with the Republican majority in both houses that I should be able to sit here and say, well, yeah, it's going to go on to Dayton's desk and he's going to have to sign it or not. I'm not that confident. I hope it passes. I support it completely, but I've seen too many wishy-washy types that are supposedly on our side knuckle under at the last minute.
And I believe if it makes it to Mark Dayton's desk, he'll veto it.
Oh, I believe so too. But again, see, he doesn't have to worry personally because he's not up for election this time. And by the time it comes around again, yeah. But if I were talking to Mark Dayton myself from a political angle, I'd say, hey, you got nothing to lose. Sign it. By the time you're ready for re-election, nobody of your constituency is going to remember or care that you signed it. So
and we'll have already proved everything was
fine. And they're going to vote for you anyway. Exactly. So the smart political play for him would be to sign it long-term for his own career. But I have a feeling that if he vetoes it, it could hurt Obama's chances in the state as well, because the gun owners would then be, oh, Democrats anti-gun again.
Let's just take a couple minutes and talk about that federal legislation. And and you're referring to being able to carry guns across state lines.
In other words, let's
explain
make it,
that to the
let's make it
listeners.
like a driver's license. If Sue got a driver's license in Minnesota, she can drive to Florida and back, and everybody recognizes, even though they look different, they have different ages. You know, some of these rural states, you can get a driver's license when you're 14, that kind of thing. But we all recognize, you know, it's the Interstate Commerce Clause, which has been turned on its head, by the way. And so, well, why not the same with, well, that was a problem when you had multiple states that didn't have a carry permit, because then their residents would say, well, wait a minute, those two people from Minnesota, they get to carry in my state, but I can't. Now it's only one state left, by the way, now that Wisconsin has passed their carry permit law, unfortunately.
So you firmly believe that Harry Reid will never let it out of the Senate
No,
to get
no,
to
because
Obama's
Obama
desk?
doesn't want to have to make that choice. No, he does not want to have to sign it or not sign it. He wants to vote present by simply not having to deal with it.
Especially in an election year.
I guarantee you it's been Obama to Reid, don't you dare put that bill on my desk.
If people wanted to get more information about your class that you teach, or to have you come and speak about Second Amendment issues, where would they get more information?
They can just call me. I get calls at all hours of the day and night. I've had to call attorneys for people who got in trouble. 612-240-6080, or you can go to my website, www.sditraining.net.
Okay, now I want you to look into the camera, and I want you to tell people why you believe The Second Amendment is so important that we continue to fight to keep our right to bear arms.
It's a good point, Sue. The reason the Second Amendment is so important, and there are a lot of misconceptions about it, it was never about hunting or sport. The people who are trying to, if they could, overturn the Second Amendment, try often to say that, well, hunting is fine, sport shooting is fine, but nobody, quote, needs a gun for self-defense, or this, we have the police, all these other bogus arguments. But when they wrote the Second Amendment, the reason that they referred to a well-regulated militia is the idea of owning a gun for self-defense was a given. Nobody even thought of it as it being something to question. The idea that you have the right of self-defense, that's pretty much ingrained in every culture throughout the world, that of course you have a right to protect yourself, your family, and your fellow citizens. So they didn't write it for that because it was a given. They wrote it for the express purpose of saying free people have a right to protect themselves not just from domestic violence, but from governmental violence. They specifically put that in there to let everyone know what we're saying is everybody agrees you have a right to self-defense and you should be able to own firearms. If you were to ask them today, should a person be allowed to carry a gun, they would have said, oh, of course, why not, right? In fact, there are numerous writings amongst the Founding Fathers where they talk to he who goes unarmed is a fool, right? Who goes about the land unarmed is a fool. So there was actually an expansion of it. So they were saying, we believe you have a right to own, keep, and bear arms. And interesting in the choice of words, not just own, keep, but bear. What they said is you have a right to own and carry firearms, right? But they expanded it to get into the political sphere to say that ultimately, the ultimate protection of a free people against an overbearing tyrannical government is arms in the hands of the people. And that's been lost in all of the what I call misinterpretations of the law over these years.
I'll never stop fighting for our Second Amendment rights. I encourage everyone to go out, get their carry permits. 92,000 Minnesotans already have it. The number's increasing, especially for women. And guns are not scary things. I love mine. Love it, love it, love it.
Well, God bless you.
So thank you so much, John Caile. Really appreciate you being here today. I think the listeners will really enjoyed this. Thank you. We're out of time. If you find yourself agreeing with our guest, you might be a libertarian. To find out, take the world's smallest quiz at www.theadvocates.org. Remember, Libertarian Viewpoint brings you the non-government, liberty-based solution that other media refuse to tell you about. Liberty works, and it is always the best choice. If anyone in government can prove otherwise, I challenge them to speak up. To view past shows, search YouTube using Libertarian Viewpoint. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for other shows of Libertarian Viewpoint.